Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's lecture, which is the fourth in 4 lectures that I've been giving this year about heritage and about attitudes to heritage, about the philosophy of heritage, and about the practice of heritage. My first 3 lectures were pretty practical and gave many very practical, solid, concrete examples of actual cases, actual issues that have come up over the last 10 years or so to illustrate my arguments. Tonight, I'm afraid I'm going to move away from the intensely practical, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in the abstract, because I'd like to reflect on a question that exercises many people who are involved in what I will call cultural heritage across Europe. And that is, what should the relationship be between the state and the individual as far as heritage is concerned? In a world where the vast proportion of cultural heritage is in the ownership of private individuals, what role does the state actually have? Should the state have a role? And of course, if it should have a role, what exactly should that be? Well, I intend to dispatch the very first question pretty quickly, because in every single European country, in fact, in almost every country in the world, the state does intervene in privately owned heritage. It does so on different terms and under different laws, but intervene it does. In 2013, what was then called English Heritage celebrated the centenary of the British government's direct involvement in heritage. And it's worth considering just for a few moments why the British government began to take this interest. And in a book that I wrote in 2015 called Men from the Ministry, I argued that it was twofold: market failure and education. By market failure, I mean the inability of individuals to continue to preserve places that had a value not only to the owner of that place, but to society as a whole. This had become an increasing problem after the agricultural depression of the 1870s. Increasingly, landowners with major medieval monuments in their parks and gardens found that they couldn't afford to maintain them, and so began to look to the state to take them on and look after them on their behalf. And so, for instance, Rievaulx Abbey, that came into state care in 1917, was a public asset in private ownership, where the private individual could no longer afford to keep the thing standing. The second reason for intervention in heritage was education. Learning about history is, of course, a source of personal enjoyment, but it becomes a desirable objective for society as a whole when it is linked to the projection of a national identity and social cohesion. And in 1913, a sense of Britishness was seen as an important political objective in the face of challenges to national power and identity from Germany and America. And the origins of the 1913 Ancient Monuments Act were as much in the Department of Education as in the Ministry of Works. Interestingly, I think that these two arguments for state involvement in heritage, market failure and education, remain as important today as they were then. Of course, the first of these is the justification for listed building and scheduled monument legislation. In other words, private owners making changes to buildings or monuments that have an impact on the identity, beauty, and economy of a wider area. The main response to this is regulation through the planning system, but there's also an argument for public investment when private investment alone would be uneconomic. In other words, grants from the state. In addition to this, heritage is conserved for the future as well as current generations, but the market, of course, cannot ask future generations to pay because they're not born yet. While it is true that politicians have a notoriously short-term view, intergenerational impacts and benefits are precisely why government needs to be involved. All these arguments for state intervention in privately owned assets are justified by the failure of normal private enterprise transactions to provide for them. The other argument for state intervention, if you like, the education argument, I think also remains pertinent today. A sense of Englishness or Britishness is becoming important against a background of both Brexit and of increasing devolution. The history of the place we all share by living in it can help build a common interest across different communities. There's an argument for the state to support broader access and participation in order to achieve these objectives. In Scotland and Wales, these arguments have been recognised politically. Heritage funding per capita in the home countries is in the ratio of 9 to 5 to 2. 9 parts Scotland, 5 parts Wales, 2 parts England. And the very high level of Scottish investment in heritage over the last few years illustrates well the linkage between identity and state intervention. Well, in addition to the two original reasons for state intervention in heritage since the Second World War, some new reasons have become important. And the first of these, of course, is tourism. In recent years, the inextricable link between heritage and tourism has been well made. However, while that is an argument for its value, it doesn't necessarily mean that the state should fund it. And the recent history of state support for tourism has been absolutely dismal. And it shows that politicians generally believe that tourism can be supported by the market with minimal state intervention. Visitors are generally very happy to pay admission charges to attractions which are popular to them, and attractions are keen to promote themselves. So what need is there for the state to become involved? However, you might argue that the streets of Bath should be funded by the local authority in support of Bath's tourist appeal, and we'll come back to look at this sort of argument towards the end of my lecture tonight. And this argument about the attractiveness of buildings and places for tourism is very closely connected to bigger ideas of place. And this is to say that places are attractive and have a depth of history and heritage. These are the places which are the most successful places to live in and to work in. They're places that attract tourists, and they're places that attract external investment. It can be argued that the state has a role to play in coordinating and, where necessary, enforcing and paying for the special historic qualities of places to keep them distinctive and attractive and to keep on attracting inward investment. The most recent argument for state intervention in heritage is known as well-being. In recognition that culture and heritage won't lead to hundreds of thousands of new jobs and businesses, in England, the DCMS is trying to make the case that heritage is in fact important for well-being, which is a government priority. This has its origins in the promotion of the idea of happiness as a measure of success for a country, rather than just the level of economic development. Because obviously, as people get richer, they don't necessarily get happier, although we sometimes think there is a direct connection between the two. Heritage contributes to mental health and the quality of the environment, both determinants of happiness. And recent work by the Department of Culture has focused on trying to monetize these well-being benefits. This provides a unit to measure the relative impact of different interventions rather than justifying particular levels of investment. So, research published in 2014 shows, amazingly, that visiting heritage has the same impact on well-being as £1,646, which is an extraordinarily precise figure to give, rather than playing sport, because sport only has a benefit on your well-being of £1,000. And participation in the arts has a benefit on your well-being of £1,152.50. So, ladies and gentlemen, in short, these arguments for state involvement between them have sustained a degree of investment in the nation's heritage since the war. However, as the example of well-being shows, the Department of Culture, and in fact most cultural bodies, are searching for ways to reinforce their claim to government funding. Likewise, private owners, represented by the Historic Houses Association, the Country Landowners Association, as well as the various amenity societies, argue vociferously for tax breaks, for grants, and for favourable legislative frameworks. And various approaches have been taken by these bodies to argue for state support for heritage. And the meat of my lecture this evening is to look at what these arguments are, interrogate them, work out how successful they have been, and suggest perhaps a way forward for the future. So let me start with the first of these big arguments for heritage, and that is, I'm a bit short of pictures to show for this, so there are a few words on here just to sort of keep you going. Instrumentalism. This is the notion that the policy justification for a particular course of action primarily lies in its positive economic impact. This, of course, is not a new idea, but its modern history originates with Mrs. Thatcher's government. In fact, the creation of English heritage in 1983 can be seen as a part of a trend to make supposedly unproductive parts of government more businesslike and efficient, and therefore more beneficial to the economy. And this businesslike attitude to heritage was part of a more general industrialization of society and the economy in the 1980s. It was in the 80s that the tourist industry, the leisure industry, the heritage industry all became phrases that we were familiar with. This conservative industrialization of culture continued after the 1992 election with John Major's creation for the first time of a Department of State within the government, the Department of National Heritage. This was a way of properly managing and making accountable a group of broadly similar activities. It was a sort of nationalisation of the museums, galleries, sport and the media as a new state-run industry. Well, in 1995, as leader of the opposition, Tony Blair went to Australia, where he was impressed by the Labour Prime Minister's Paul Keating's cultural policy. This cultural policy was known as Creative Nation. And the essence of the Australian cultural policy was the commodification of culture so that its economic and social impact could be measured and then selectively supported by state investment to boost the national economy. When Mr. Blair got back to England, he built these Creative Nation ideas into the Labour Party manifesto. And so after they came to government in 1997, the Department of National Heritage was renamed the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, the DCMS. This wasn't only just a rebranding, it represented a genuine change of direction. Chris Smith, the new Secretary of State, the first Secretary of State, the DCMS, published a document called A New Cultural Framework in 1998. And this explained that what were now rebranded as the creative industries were a new growth sector in the economy, both nationally and globally, and against a decline in traditional manufacturing industries, these were a future source of employment and prosperity for the nation. In other words, what New Labour did was they monetised both the products of this nationalised industries that the Tories had created and the private businesses which were regarded as being creative producers themselves. Well, after 7 years in power, there began to be signs that the new Labour policy towards culture might be shifting. And this was because, although DCMS was getting substantial increases in grant, the department was felt to be falling behind some other parts of government. And so in 2004, Tessa Jowell, this is my favourite picture of her, Chris Smith's successor as Secretary of State, published an essay looking at the relationship between government and the bodies in her department. And in it, she wrote the following, and I quote, "Too often, politicians have been forced to debate culture in terms only of its instrumental benefits to other agendas, and that we need to find a way to demonstrate the personal value added which comes from engagement with culture." Well, Tessa Jowell never succeeded in translating her views into policy, perhaps because of the force of Treasury opinion against her. But her successor, James Purnell, who's now Director of Policy at the BBC, became Secretary of State and immediately rejected the instrumentalist approach to measuring cultural activity. And in August 2007, his second month in post, he asked Sir Brian McMaster, the former director of the Edinburgh Festival, to undertake a review to see how it might be possible to move the discussion about the public subsidy of the arts from measurement to judgment, from a culture of target setting against economic outcomes to a new emphasis on excellence. Well, in January 2008, the McMaster Review was published, and the same month, James Purnell was reshuffled to the Department of Work and Pensions, and the report was buried. Well, in 2010, the election brought a solidly Tory group of ministers at DCMS in the coalition government. Jeremy Hunt's Heritage and Tourism Minister made a speech on one of his first public occasions, arguing that heritage was important for itself and not just for the economic effects that it made. But of course, both he and his boss, Jeremy Hunt, were overwhelmed by the financial crisis and the cuts they had to impose. Jeremy Hunt's successor, Maria Miller, returned to the instrumentalist camp and gave her first speech in April 2013. It was called "Testing Times, Fighting Culture's Corner in an Age of Austerity." And in it, she argued from a purely instrumentalist point of view that cultural bodies needed to make a better economic case for their very existence. But like Tessa Jowell, but slightly faster, she soon learnt that this approach got her nowhere. In January 2014, she gave her second speech. This was called "What Makes Our Hearts Sing," in which she argued that it was more than economic arguments that were needed to justify state funding on culture. Now, I'm not going to go on blow by blow through each Secretary of State. That's, I think, enough Secretaries of State. Thank you very much. My point is that since 1997, culture secretaries have seen the way to get culture taken seriously is to take into account the economic benefits of heritage. The argument goes, if we compile a dossier of data that demonstrates the positive effects of heritage on the economy, and therefore on society, it'll be given greater weight in the decision-making process. And that is why documents like this one, called Heritage Counts, which in fact I founded 12 years ago now, a compendium of heritage data arguing for state involvement in heritage, became very popular. And thanks to documents like this, we now know that UK heritage-based tourism directly accounts for £5 billion worth of GDP and 134,000 jobs. But you know, there is a fatal flaw in this sort of instrumentalism. And that is quite simply that everybody is at it. So, in the area of health, it has been calculated that in the UK, treating diseases directly caused by smoking produces medical bills of more than £5 billion a year, which in 2005 to 6 equated to 5.5% of the entire National Health Service budget. These figures alone, I think, are much more likely to influence policy than any figure calculated for the supposedly beneficial effects of cultural heritage. This has not, of course, stopped people trying. The Heritage Lottery Fund has recently shown the benefits from heritage volunteering. But surely, compared with giving up smoking or not drinking quite so much, these figures are irrelevant. So, let's move beyond instrumentalism. Let's move to another very fashionable argument for heritage: sustainable development. Now, sustainable development was a term used most powerfully in 1987 by the Brundtland Commission, which coined what has become its most often quoted definition: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That is what sustainable development is. An idea developed during the 1980s and now accepted as a principle globally. Sustainable development is most frequently expressed in terms of 3 dimensions, or 3 pillars. And these pillars are economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental balance. And if you have all of those, you have a sustainable society. Now, inevitably, this concept of sustainable development has been challenged. Some think the whole idea is too vague to be useful as an organising concept for making policy on. Other people respect its usefulness, but see these 3 pillars as inadequate to capture the concerns of society. In particular, it's been argued that the 3 pillars ignore the powerful role that culture actually plays. And so in 2001, the Australian writer John Hawkes argued that there should be a 4th pillar added, and this pillar should be culture. And this argument that truly sustainable development needs to include cultural vitality has been taken on board by UNESCO and indeed by the European Union. Now, the original Brundtland Commission and its definition was driven by a concern about the use of resources, about us now not using up more than our fair share of irreplaceable resources, including rainforests and fossil fuels and everything else. And I think it can be argued, pretty convincingly, that our heritage is also an irreplaceable resource. Once it's gone, it's gone. It's gone forever. And so a few countries have now built the principle of the 4th pillar into economic policy. And amazingly, England is in advance of many, because thanks to the efforts of English Heritage and 1 or 2 other bodies, the UK government actually built the 4th pillar into its national planning framework. And since 2012, building development that does not respect and enhance heritage is now categorised as being unsustainable. But despite the UK national planning policy containing the principle of the 4th pillar, it hasn't yet found widespread application in policy as a whole. So why is this? Well, firstly, I think governments generally, not only in this country but across Europe, aren't really structured to be able to rise above the limitations of short-term political and budgetary cycles. And they find it very difficult to make the kinds of long-term decisions that sustainable development demands. And secondly, I think today, in 2017, is much harder than it was in 2000 to persuade governments that the concept of sustainable development is indeed a good organising principle for society, because growth, financial recovery and economic resilience are the top priorities everywhere. And this has led some governments to putting to one side their commitments to sustainable development. Of course, we're seeing that in America in the Trump government at this very moment. And I think the third reason why sustainable development, and particularly the fourth pillar, has not been widely accepted is because the introduction of culture into the equation is seen as just an unnecessary complication to an already quite complex organising idea. And so it has been argued that a way is needed for an argument for heritage that integrates heritage properly into macroeconomic and social policy, an argument that lifts it out of a narrow category and argues that it should influence mainstream policy. And it is possible to do this in another argument in terms of economic theory, and this is called production factors. Now, heritage is normally considered as a cost in economics. Maintaining historic buildings, museums and galleries, maintaining historic parks and gardens is seen as an absolute cost to the state, one that has no return but is undertaken as a moral duty, the sort of price that governments have to pay for being seen as civilized. Now, obviously, most people in this room, I guess, would argue this is rather a short-term view. But under a longer-term perspective, cultural heritage can actually be seen as a special component in the production function of European GDP, a production factor in its growth, in its competitiveness, and ultimately in European society's welfare. The assessment of heritage as a cost factor echoes the now outdated and discredited view of environmental protection. It's now, I think, universally accepted that environmental neglect has severe economic and social impacts which outweigh the corresponding costs of protection. Accordingly, environmental considerations are now universally considered in policy terms and are an integral part of overall macro and also microeconomic production models and calculations. And so there have been strong arguments that heritage, like environmental concerns, should also be considered as a production factor. Well, there are some obvious examples. Tourism. Tourism owes much of its attractiveness to heritage, whether it's in cities like London or the countryside. This generates not only significant European tourism, but massive tourism from outside Europe. But it isn't tourism alone where heritage is a crucial production and employment factor, because businesses tend to locate in culturally attractive cities and regions, because, quite simply, it is easier to attract key executives and technicians who want to live in attractive and interesting places. And so, where we are this evening, the City of London sees its heritage and its cultural offer as key to sustaining its position as a world finance centre. And this has spread more widely with the move of hedge funds and boutique financial services to Mayfair, principally because Mayfair is a civilised and beautiful place to do business, mixed in with galleries and restaurants and shops. The example of research and development intensive companies is a very telling one also. They almost all have a marked preference to locate in historic areas, in old converted industrial buildings. The huge success of the regenerated, there's Berkeley Square, King's Cross is a prime example of this. Highly attractive to technological companies like Google and Facebook and everybody else, because of its heritage. And so heritage enables and encourages and stimulates innovation, and it enhances long-term competitiveness of the economy. Here is the custard factory in Birmingham, another very good example. And I think similar considerations are perhaps valid for what might be described as intangible cultural heritage, things like French cuisine, Italian cheese, the Manchester club scene, if you can face it. The same is true, I think, of films. The Edinburgh Festival, for instance, is a good example. And lastly, and this is not in order of priority, the rich availability of heritage enriches the quality of life of the people who live in our country and contributes to their well-being well beyond what can be measured in terms of pure income statistics. This is no blinding revelation. City governments from time immemorial have recognised the benefits to the population that heritage brings. Here is Siena. And in 1309, the statutes of the municipality attributed to heritage the happiness and prosperity of the people who lived in the town, based, they said, on the beauty, decorum, dignity of the public spaces there. Now, once you start to regard heritage as a production factor in the economy, some very significant things begin to change. Obviously, it will bring about a change to economic policy, but crucially, it begins to make sense for the private sector to be more deeply involved in exploiting the potential offered by it. The old model, whereby the private sector invests in tourism such as hotels and restaurants and shops, while the public sector invests in museums and public buildings, is put into question. A more rational approach would consist in the private sector getting much more involved in heritage at large in order to optimise the use of the production factor in the business model as a whole. So I think production factors are a very attractive argument for heritage, as it captures the contributions of the state and of the private sector into a single model. But unfortunately, this is the very weakness of the idea. Because since the Second World War, there's been a strong view of the boundaries between state and private investment. Heritage is all too often seen as being in the state sector, and when the state fails to invest, as it increasingly does, blame is laid at the door of the politicians, rather than making an effective transfer of responsibility to the private sector to look after it. So, here is an attitudinal problem, a debate about who owns heritage and who should take responsibility for it. And here we come on to my fourth and final argument for heritage. This is called the commons. Now, the commons, from the Latin word communis, dates back to the Middle Ages as a communal arrangement for the collective management of land and property, including grazing land, forests, irrigation systems. In England, it survives principally as a term to describe land held communally, a common land. But such common pool resources have always faced social dilemmas. In particular, resources that are managed collectively are at risk of overuse, as communal ownership threatens their very existence. Social scientists have recognised a potential tragedy of the commons, it's called, tragedy of the commons, in situations where self-interested individuals acting independently fail to cooperate and behave in the interest of the whole group. and by doing so, they deplete the common resource. Now, solutions to this dilemma could be public intervention, the state taking over the commonly held asset, centralising the management of it, or privatising the asset. These are sort of market-based approaches. But this wonderful lady here, Elinor Ostrom, won a Nobel Prize for pointing out that neither centralised management nor privatisation of the commons provide the ideal solution. She showed that there was a third way of governance, which could be attached to community assets, avoiding these conflicts. Now, this is all important, this social science is all important because cultural resources are essentially commons. Now, I'll just explain that. An obvious example is the use of heritage for tourism, where here you've got York, the commonly owned twisting, turning and cobbled streets of York bring benefits to everybody, to the whole community. Deterioration or destruction of this landscape and its heritage, or an underestimation of its value, can be considered as an expression of the tragedy of the commons. So if the council in York decided to take up all the cobbles and lay it down to tarmac or to concrete, they would be destroying this commonly owned asset which everybody benefits from. Now, you see this in so many developing countries. The tragedy of the Algarve, where everybody came for all this and they got all that, because the commonly owned asset, which everybody made their living out of, was destroyed by people who were trying to make money out of it. I love this Osbert Lancaster cartoon from 1969, which shows a heritage tour of the city of London. And the tourist guide is saying, that was St. Paul's, that was. And you can see it just sticking out. This is the destruction of a commonly owned asset that benefits everybody. So Ostrom's third way of governance is about community cultural responsibility, a way out of the heritage tragedy of the commons. And in fact, several recent developments in European and UK policy have focused on the collective and social dimension of heritage and of community-led development. The Heritage Lottery Fund has been at the forefront of encouraging and financing community heritage schemes and innovative types of governance. So, government in the UK have looked at this idea, and I think we can see neighbourhood planning, which has been strongly supported by the government as an attempt by central government to translate responsibility for the commons to local people. And so localism is therefore a political expression of this idea of the commons, and I think provides a possible vehicle for arguing for the responsibility of heritage commons being translated to local people. But there are two problems with the idea of the commons. The first is the problem that is similar to that of the production factors. In other words, a perception amongst people that it's the responsibility of the state to safeguard collective heritage rather than the duty of citizens. And this can lead and has led and continues to lead to a reluctance to take on responsibilities for communally owned heritage by individuals. However, the irony is that the very environment that we strive to protect was originally created by communal and private initiative rather than planning or state action. And therefore, it should be possible to reverse the model and replicate the original conditions and translate responsibility of heritage to local communities. But the second problem is much more difficult. And this is the potential clash between the people and the experts that the notion of the commons represents. Because if a community wants to sweep away heritage of a national value as part of their desire to manage their common heritage, experts, university professors, amenity societies, people like me, might oppose each other. And I'll give you a current illustration of this, and if some of you were at my recent lecture talking about the planning system, you will remember this example I've given, and this is an extremely good example. Here we have the famous view of Ely Cathedral, the great ship of the Fens, rising up on its knoll above the watery lowlands. Ely, as you know, is a major railway junction, and the railway divides the town from the A14, meaning that traffic has got to cross the line at a level crossing and then go through the suburbs of the town before it reaches the big roads. The local people want to build a bypass that will take the traffic over the line and round the edge of the town, and in the process, there's the cathedral. It blots out the world-famous views of the cathedral. And so, here you have the expert view that this is a total catastrophe, which I was saying from this very podium a few weeks ago, but the local view, which is that, well, as we drive to the supermarket, we'll get lovely views of the cathedral as we go over the bypass. So, taking the local view, the heritage of the commons might not always produce what the experts think is the right answer. So here you have a commons, which is the view of the cathedral, being, in some people's view, destroyed by the people who own it. Well, several of these arguments that I've gone into in a little bit of depth this evening are different ways of saying the same thing. And underlying them is a truth very nicely put by the Irish political theorist and philosopher Edmund Burke, because he described society as a coalition between the living, the dead, and the yet-to-be born. The fact is that people passionately believe that what they are doing will leave a legacy for future generations. Thus, our heritage belongs to the living, to the dead, and to the unborn. And we can't justify its protection, its retention, or its alteration in terms of short-term economics only. Perhaps a more modern way of arguing this is in terms of intergenerational equity. This means that we have a responsibility to conserve resources for future generations and not use up more than our fair share, in other words, sustainable development. We have a responsibility to the past and to the future to steward our resources and protect our ancestors' legacy for our descendants. Although it's quite difficult to pin this down in policy terms, most people, including most politicians, get this, if only because we want to give ourselves some permanence beyond our own lives. And so I think we shouldn't be afraid of using this argument. So, where do we put our energy? Do we continue to try and compile more and more elaborate data? Or do we try and change the nature of the argument? Well, of course, we need to do a bit of both, but the current balance of energy, I think, is wrong. We do probably need to compile economic data for use in a very small number of specific cases where it genuinely has a chance of influencing the outcome of the debate. But I think we need to put much more of our energy into changing the nature of the argument about why heritage is important. And this, I think, would require us to change some of the language that heritage advocates have traditionally used and start to align it to the objectives of government. The current government's core narrative focuses on the economy, on fairness and aspiration, and in addition, on Britain's role in the world. And I think it's pretty unlikely that any future government is likely to make much change to this, although they might express the ideas within it slightly differently. So, taking these priorities, how would an argument for heritage play out in the future? Well, I think that the economic production factor argument is extremely strong and effective here. Heritage is not an economic input, it is an economic output. I think we need to get politicians to think about heritage as part of the nation's capital, just like coal or copper or tin were part of Victorian Britain's capital. Today, our strong and rich heritage does the same job as those mineral wealth did in the 19th century. And this means that we change the language of cultural engagement to speak of investment and return on capital. So in this line of argument, we have a responsibility not only to protect our heritage for the future, but to invest and develop it as a part of economic productivity for the future. So that deals with the economic aspect. Then we have fairness and aspiration. Now this is a major narrative for all political parties, and two of the arguments for heritage contribute to reinforcing heritage's role here. First, the fourth pillar of sustainable development emphasises that policy must have a soul as well as a bottom line. With a sophisticated, articulate populace in relatively prosperous times, people want more out of their lives than basic economic outputs. It's not a question of development at all costs. In terms of heritage, this means keeping a mix of the old and the new, and this is the visual definition of our national identity, who we are, where we are, and what we are comfortable with. The second argument is for the commons. This is about fostering a sense of shared responsibility for the historic environment, empowering people to take control of the places where they live, and therefore taking control of their lives. It's about fostering a sense of local and civic pride and ownership, recreating some of the spirit that created the historic places that we now admire so much. And finally, considering Britain's place in the world, we return to the economic production factors, which show that Britain is in fact one of the top 3 destinations in the world for tourism, and one of the most attractive places in the globe to base corporate headquarters, because, quite simply, Britain's heritage attracts tourism and the best of global talent to work in this country. So, in conclusion, I believe we need to recast the arguments for heritage in this age of austerity and societal change. Our heritage isn't just about money and shouldn't be argued for as such. It's all about making a prosperous, stable and cohesive society, and I think that politicians need to start to recognise that. Thank you.